Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. Today I'm here with Father Deacon Ananias Sorum and, of course, Christopher Tomaszewski. So, Father Deacon, this is the first time that I've had you on the show. So, I'd just be interested in you introducing yourself to the audience and if there's anything interesting that's been happening in your life.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here. And so, yes, I'm Father Deacon Ananias, and just a little bit about my background. I got a bachelor's in classical liberal arts from Thomas Aquinas College, a master's in philosophy from University College Dublin, kind of specializing in epistemology, particularly in Aristotle. Obviously, that came from my background. An appreciation of Aristotle from Thomas Aquinas College. And then did a PhD in philosophy of mind, where I kind of combined a lot of different things because I was interested in philosophy of science, epistemology, and philosophy of mind, and kind of brought in what I thought could be a solution through a kind of neo-Aristotelian kind of Thomistic view that was something new to kind of contemporary philosophy of mind, because they're either like kind of Cartesian substance dualists or kind of reductive materials or something like that. So that's kind of the work that I did in that, and that was really enjoyable. I also got a diaconal vocations program, went to seminary at St. Vladimir's, and I'm currently residing in Montana. I lived in California, where I worked as a deacon at a Romanian Orthodox parish for 4 years, and teaching at Cal State Fullerton, Azusa Pacific University, Fullerton College. But now I'm here in Helena, Montana, teaching philosophy at Carroll College, which is a wonderful Catholic liberal arts college here in Montana, while I still teach remotely Fullerton College. So that's a bit about, and some of the stuff that I've been doing is, let's see, recently kind of delivered some papers at some philosophy conferences on scientism. Eric Voegelin, I don't know if you're familiar with Eric Voegelin and his kind of science, politics, and Gnosticism. And I continue to work on epistemology and writing some papers about kind of justifying knowledge in different paradigms, critiquing kind of foundationalism and comparing that with various other epistemological views. So that's boring, but that's my life.
So it's true that you were a convert from Protestantism, right? And the reason why I bring it up too is because I'm
right.
a convert
Yeah.
as well from Protestantism, but to Catholicism.
Yeah, I'm a convert. I came from a Lutheran background and then converted to Orthodoxy. I think it was 2012 or 13 when I just gotten my PhD and I'd come back from Ireland.
All right, thank you, Father. And now to Christopher. Could you share any interesting updates that have happened in your life? Because I know there have been quite a few. And since you've been on the show multiple times, I won't have you go into all your credentials unless there's anything you want to add in there too.
Well, I don't know. Let me just start from the beginning, because I don't know what I've told your particular viewers as opposed to other podcasts and YouTube channels I've been on. So I'm a native of Philadelphia. And I spent 2 years studying for the Roman Catholic Diocese of Philadelphia as a seminarian. I left that. I'm now married. There is an inconsistency between those two things for me, perhaps not for Father. And I went on to complete undergraduate degrees in philosophy and mathematics at Villanova. I then did an MA in philosophy at the University of Connecticut, and I'll be finishing this spring or summer a PhD in philosophy at Baylor University. And I have recently been appointed tenure track assistant professor of philosophy at Belmont Abbey College, just outside Charlotte, North Carolina. So my wife and I are very excited about that, and we'll be moving to North Carolina in in July, and I'm very excited I'll have the opportunity to teach some of the seminarians of the Diocese of Charlotte there, help them get their degrees in philosophy. So it's a great opportunity for me to, well, first of all, have a job, period, since that's somewhat difficult in philosophy, but also to have a hand in the formation of seminarians, which is near and dear to my heart. So it's a great job for me, and my wife is thrilled about North Carolina. It's a good place to settle down. So I'll be, the good news about this is I'll be in professional philosophy permanently now, writing and doing podcasts like this, YouTube channels, what have you, for some time to come now. And I primarily work in, well, my dissertation is on philosophical anthropology, the soul, the interim state, stuff like that. And more broadly, I do metaphysics, philosophy, religion, and medieval philosophy, especially Thomas Aquinas.
So I just want to also specify for the audience that a little bit earlier, Christopher was having some delay with the sound. So if ever during the conversation, it seems as if like Christopher is interrupting Father Deacon, it's not because, well, at least I hope it's not because he's intentionally doing it, but it's just because there's delay. So I don't know, Christopher, has the sound improved on your end, or is it still kind of delayed?
Yes, a little bit. It's improved. Yeah.
All right, so let's just keep on hoping and praying that it gets better and better. All right, so today we're talking about the essence energies distinction, and we're going to have Father Deacon kind of kick us off and lead the conversation, and then from there, you know, Christopher is going to express kind of maybe his thoughts, concerns, questions, or even if there's anything that he kind of particularly agrees with, right? And he's going to kind of, you know, present. I don't want to put all the Catholic tradition on his shoulders, but or the Latin tradition, right? But we'll see how it all unfolds. So, Father Deacon, can you first explain what the essence energies distinction is? And it'd be kind of nice to know about the history and how it came about.
And let me just state that by no means am I an expert on this, and I'll try my best to kind of present the Orthodox position, and then we just have a dialogue. I'll do my best to answer. I may not be the best, but I can quote some of the fathers and kind of, like you said, give some of the history of this. Now, the Greek word for energy, as you might know, is energeia, and that has kind of different connotations and meanings, activity, working, these various things. And we actually see it occur in the New Testament. And what we're going to see is kind of like you do in church history, usually because of various controversies, let's call them the heretics, that come up, that the fathers end up having to kind of refine what has been received in the faith. Many of these words then kind of get developed over time to kind of preserve the faith and the teaching received. And there's no exception also when it comes to energeia and the energies and the notion of essence and how that relates. So any questions about that? And then I'll kind of just talk a little bit about the kind of usage in the New Testament, where we see.
Yeah, Christopher, do you have any questions about that so far,
or? No, not so far.
Yeah, me neither. Yeah.
So let me just say, energeia, operation, which you'll have this translated in Latin, obviously, operatio is the typical kind of correspondence. It could be power. And you'll see oftentimes as you do other Greek words kind of interchange, like thunamos, right? Or dunamis is the English pronunciators say virtue, working. And I guess there's even an instance in the New Testament where strong. and an active form is kind of like living, and it has, showing forth, force, worketh, wrought effectually, are some was mighty, do. In the middle passive forms, you have worketh, is effectual, is wrought, effectual, worketh. These are kind of different usages that you see specifically from St. Paul in the New Testament. Now, obviously, as that gets worked out later, you get some of this in Dionysius, Basil, Gregory Nazianzus, Gregory Nyssa, Palamos, and St. John of Damascus as that kind of. So this is kind of the history. And because of certain questions and going back and forth and various issues, it gets further clarified as fact what this means. So that's kind of the beginnings of, and I don't know, I have a couple notes here. You'll find this in Ephesians 1:19, Ephesians 3:7, Ephesians 4:16, Philippians 3:21. These are all kind of usages that you'll find of energeia and the various forms of energeia. Colossians 1:29, Colossians 2:12, 2 Thessalonians 2:9, and 2 Thessalonians 2:11 are some of those. So, but it's not quite clear in the New Testament, beyond just the kind of what I said about, both in the active and passive sense, what those words mean beyond kind of worketh, showeth forth, virtue, power, operation. So those will, as the fathers discuss, those will get further clarified. I don't know if you have any questions about, I'll just kind of do that. Because I don't want to rant and pontificate. And so I'll just kind of, after saying something, just see what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, don't worry about not wanting to rant. Yeah. We're okay with like listening to kind of long explanations and thoroughness. We're fine with that. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm definitely fine with that.
I think there's some stuff. Let's see. The Epistle of Barnabas, the Shepherd of Hermas, some even, early works too, where it's mentioned. I think Clement uses it as well. So let's just, what does it really kind of get developed into, and why would it be useful? So there's different ways that we can talk about God. And you get this kind of in the Cappadocian Fathers and obviously in Palamos. Specifically, this starts to get really defined and clear what the Orthodox doctrine is. And I want to say clarification because these things are clarified because as we believe that, and I think Catholics, I know that you guys have a sense of development of doctrine, but I think we'd both say kind of a level of agreement that hopefully we're not innovating and making up things. And so the idea of kind of the fathers and the councils is to clarify what was once received and made clear to. I don't know if you guys would agree with that.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
by the time you get to the kind of Cappadocians, where you have this idea of that God can be spoken of ad intra, in himself, his ousia, his in Latin essentia, right? And that is what God is in himself and only known to himself and not known, even to the seraphim and cherubim. And then there is God, really God, outside of his essence. So that's the kind of first distinction, is that energies are not simply effects. And I know that the fathers will use analogies of like the sun giving off rays and stuff like that. And it's really easy to kind of fall into this notion of, oh, well, then energies or activities or doings of God are like effects. But the fathers are really clear to say that no, they're actually uncreated. They're really God, and they're not effects, but they're not God's essence. And as we'll see, but God's essence, they're not unconnected. God's essence is unified with theirs. So there's a real experience with the essence of God, even though the essence of God remains unknown. And so we'll talk a little bit about the kind of practicality. So it's not so, I know this stuff sounds really abstract, but there's a real kind of practical application of this and theology and the practice of prayer and asceticism and things like this, that the ways that we get to actually know God, so his essence isn't apart, it's not separated, is through his activities, because his essence is fully there with each and every one of his activities. And there's analogies that we like to use, that the way that I get to know you, Christopher, or Suan, is through the things that you do, your activities. Now, the difference is, you are not your activities, are you? And your activities are created. They're temporal. What we would say is that, well, look, there's an analogy like that with God. However, he is his activities. His essence is not separated from his activities the way it would with you, and they're uncreated, they're eternal. So there's God within himself and then God outside of himself. And that's the first kind of distinction, is that they're both really God. It's just and they're not separated. The energies and activities of God are not separated from his essence. But they're not like Neoplatonic, like emanations. And that's another thing to state too, that it's really easy when like hearing this to go, well, my gosh, that sounds like Neoplatonic. In fact, a lot of this was clarified with the fathers as refutations of Neoplatonic thought. And so one of the things that's going to become important too is that each energy is personal. It's not an impersonal kind of force emanating out. And it's really God. It's just the distinction is it's not his essence. And this is the way, because God's essence, and I think you guys would agree with this, doesn't enter into the created world. And we would both believe and hold God's essence is simple, correct? Mm-hmm. So what would it mean for God's essence to come into the temporal, finite world would to be to divide his essence? And so that's one issue that is a concern, obviously, for the fathers. And so what they're going to say is his essence does not come into the spatiotemporal kind of time in that way so that it would divide the simple essence, but his energies do. His energies are multiple, his activities. So this maintains preserves the unity of God in essence and a multiplicity where they're not divided either, so that you really experience God. And as we'll see, like St. Peter says, become partakers in the divine nature. Mm-hmm. So any questions about that? So that's...
Yeah, Christopher, do you have any questions?
I imagine we'll get further and deeper into, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Also,
yes,
real quick,
so I have two questions now.
Real quick, sorry. I hear ringing in the background. Is someone's like alarm or phone going off?
Yeah, sorry. Let me go kill that. Yeah, sorry. I'll be right back.
No, it's okay. Okay, and while Christopher is gone, Father Deacon, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you a question. So,
yeah, absolutely.
So I've often heard people say that, the essence energies distinction is an elegant way to kind of solve how God, the simple, unchanging God relates to creation. So would you say that was that what motivated the fathers to really fine tune this idea of the essence energies distinction? Or was that part of the motivation of the fathers to describe that relationship more clearly?
How God doesn't change, but...
Yeah, right. But is like somehow related to creation, or,
that's one thing, because we would both say God doesn't change in his essence, in the sense that obviously nothing's act upon God. to change his essence. And what we will see is God can change. I don't think the Roman Catholic or the Thomistic position would actually say that. So we could actually say that there are potencies in God. There's things that he doesn't do. He responds to prayers, so he could actually actualize potencies.
Yeah.
One of the things that makes that possible is the energies.
Mhm.
So that is one among many issues that the fathers are working with. So yeah, you're correct.
Yeah, and just for quick clarification, when you say that there are potencies in God, are you saying both the essence and the energies, or just the energies?
So yeah, perhaps it's beneficial, and I don't want to go too far in without because Christopher will want to hear this and probably ask questions.
Yeah.
But this is going to be defined in contradistinction to actus purus. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And there are some similarities. I know Aquinas has 3 different modes about speaking about God: similitude, analogia entis, and via negativa as well. But because of this, there's specifically the essence energies and the denial of kind of an actus purus, that the way that we do that and cash that out is going to be a little bit different, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. All right,
so
Christopher.
we'll talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, okay. So let me jump back to the claim that the energies are eternal. I assume that's your view. Is that the broad consensus of the Orthodox Church, is that the energies are eternal, that they do not begin to exist?
Yeah, you have this worked out specifically,
Okay.
like Palamos 2. And Basil against Eunomius and Palamos against Barlaam, because they're basically saying that they're created kind of graces from God. And so, yeah, this is basically dogmatized in the Orthodox doctrine that God's doings. Now, that doesn't mean there are some things that are actually in relation to creation created. But typically when we speak of the energies, and I'll go further too in the kind of that there's kind of a threefold division within the Cappadocians, ways that they speak about the energy. Each emphasizing, and I forgot to mention Maximus too. Forgive me. Saint Maximus has some important stuff to add about this too. Yeah. Anyways, go ahead.
Yeah. So I guess I would have antecedently thought, as a philosophical construct, right, as a philosophical theory of God's nature, that one of the things an essence energies distinction is supposed to accomplish is perhaps explain how God goes from, how it can be true to say that God goes from not doing a certain thing to doing a certain thing, right? How he can go from not speaking to Abraham to speaking to Abraham, and under how it can be true. All the temporal language that we use about God in Scripture can be accurate and true, and of course, on a picture of God without this distinction, that's a somewhat complicated task, right? Is to try to square all that temporal language with the divine nature. But and so it would seem, if you had the energies, well, then that really gives you like a quick, easy solution to all that stuff. But if they are eternal, as you've said, then it actually does no work for a theory of temporal language about God, right? You're basically, in this respect, the believer in an energies, in essence, energies distinction is in the same boat as the Thomist concerning how we reconcile temporal language in Scripture about God with the eternality of the divine nature.
I guess it depends on, you've got to qualify in what sense they're eternal, like I said.
Well, the sense that I had in mind is that they don't begin to exist.
They don't begin to exist, but they do have potency at the same time. So
Okay.
that's often kind of difficult for, and potency would be like dunamis, right? A power. Now, as far as the temporal order, and they're received in the temporal order, there's a beginning to know them, or something like that.
Of course.
But as far as their existence, and this is important too, and maybe I was just going to go into this, and it helps flesh this out, is to maybe better understand the essence energy distinction is to put it into contradistinction with actus purus. So the Orthodox won't actually identify the essence as with pure actuality and be. In fact, they remain completely apophatic as far as any names being attributed to the essence. So completely apophatic in that sense. So all of the names are associated to the energies. And so we would say the energies are the associated with being. So that's the first kind of distinction. And then, so those are eternal. That's what we mean by the energies, the activities, the doings of God don't come into existence. And what St. Maximus says is that God, in his essence, so he's not even bound by any of these. So that because of that distinction is important to the notion of his will, freely moves through, and it's what St. Maximus calls thought wills, through the energies. And that's what actually you see on this side in the created world. Things come into existence. But it's important yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, let me just, you just said something that I thought was interesting. So you said the energies are what I see on this side. And I would have thought, insofar as the energies are not effects of God's, but are part of God, that what I see are the effects of the energies, not the energies. Is that wrong?
Yes and no. I think you see both the effects. I don't think it's a dichotomy, because what we're going to say is that, let's, for example, the creation of you or a tree or something like that. And this is why,
sure.
And I'll just state this from the Cappadocian because it's going to help explain. The Cappadocian conception of divine energeia are divided into three. One part relating to creation. So this is what we're going to talk about. St. Maximus calls that the logoi, right? The plural of logos. Another to God's eternal attributes. And the fathers use the phrase, the things around God, obviously around his essence. And the third is to the activity and energy of God that can be shared by creature, which they tend to reserve only for the term energeia. They won't use that for the logoi. And the point of the term, using the term logos rather than energeia, is to emphasize that God is present in creatures. Not only is the creator and sustainer, but their meaning and purpose, right? The kind of telos. So I think we can say both and, that yes, amongst the distinctions that I just made, you have one part relating to creation. And from this view, the effects of that. However, the God's energeia, his energies are immanently present within, and they sustain, right? So you're actually participating in God, in creation. So this is why St. Paul says, all men are without excuse, because God is actually not in essence, but as energies in creation. So we, instead of having the kind of sharp distinction between what we would call natural theology and revealed, is Demetrius Staniloae says, we make the distinction between natural revelation and supernatural revelation, in which natural revelation has its meaning and context within the supernatural revelation, exactly in the way that I said. So you're experiencing God imminently. You're not removed by kind of like just cause and effects, but you're actually experiencing and participating in God in the created world. And that's what we would call natural revelation in light of the supernatural revelation. And I think that's an important part, especially when we get to Timothy, where St. Paul says we will become partakers in the divine nature and what that actually means. Yeah, excellent question.
So is the relationship, is it the relationship between creatures and the energies is one of participation then on this model?
Yes. Exactly. That's how. And we have this doctrine of theosis, which is to become what God is by nature, not in essence, obviously, because that wouldn't make sense. And I'm going to talk a little bit why the energies are useful. Because if we were to become partakers in the divine nature, it's going to turn out there's not going to be a trinity, it's going to be a quadrinity, and so on ad infinitum, as many as people enter into participating in the divine nature. So that distinction is going to become important too, in terms of what Paul said.
So is it accurate then to say that nothing participates in the essence itself, or the divine persons do, and that's it?
That's right.
Okay.
That's why you say ad intra, right, in the Latin. God within in himself.
So
and nobody sees that.
Which is even, it? Is it?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Is it nothing participates in the divine essence, or the divine persons alone participate in the divine essence?
I'm going to probably shy away from the language of participating in, as far as the Holy Trinity, the persons of the Holy Trinity. Let's just say if by participation you mean they fully share that, and kind of unique ways, right? The Father is the archean, the monarchia, the cause. The Son is shares fully in the divine essence, in that he is the only eternally begotten, and the Holy Spirit the only spirated, if that's what you mean. But that, as far as having, knowing, and there's also the Greek word perichoresis, speaking about this kind of indwelling or dancing with referring to the essence too. Like they all share it, but they're distinguishing the persons by the way that they obviously proceed or spirate. And that essence, St. Basil says that the divine essence always exists in the mode in hypostasized, right? In the mode of a person, the tropos, which isn't too far from, this might be reminiscent of like Aristotle, that there are no bare naked essences out there, right? They always have to exist in some particular mode, concretized mode. And for us human beings and for God, it exists uniquely in the mode of a person. And that's not Sabellianism, by the way, just to make that clear. But I think you'd agree with that. As far as the essence.
Yeah. So it sounds to me as if you're that the Orthodox model, with an essence energies distinction, is not just going to reject the identification of God with actus purus, but also to reject the identity of God's of the divine essence with being itself. Is that right?
That's right. Let me just read two quotes from you.
Yeah.
That kind of capture this. would you open with me to your Bibles? No, I'm kidding. I'm not a Protestant. Would you open with me to St. John of Damascus on the Orthodox faith? On the Orthodox faith, is you're probably well familiar with, Aquinas quotes him quite a bit, that St. John says, God does not belong to the class of existing things, not that he has no existence, but that he is above all existing things, nay, even above existence itself. For if all forms of knowledge have to do with what exists, assuredly that which is above knowledge must certainly also be above essence. And then another good quote is from the Theophanies of St. Gregory Palamas. The super essential nature of God is not a subject for speech or thought or even contemplation, for it's far removed from that, from all that exists and more unknowable, being founded upon the uncircumscribed might of the celestial spirits, incomprehensible and ineffable to all forever. So even in the eschaton, we won't behold the essence of God on this position. There is no name whereby it can be named, neither in this age nor in the age to come, no word founded in the soul and uttered by the tongue, nor contact, whether sensible or intellectual, nor any image which may be afforded any knowledge of its subject, if this be not perfect incomprehensibility, which one acknowledges in denying all that can be named. None can properly name its essence or nature if he truly be seeking the truth that is above all the truths. So this kind of captures why we wouldn't have being is what's known and understood. Being exists in the mind. Aquinas talks about this, and as well as going all the way back to Aristotle, and some of the pre-Socratics like Parmenides and things like that. So again, like St. John Damascus says, we're not saying he doesn't exist. We're saying he's beyond all knowing and unknowing. I mean, it's just, there are no names. So we don't associate actus purus with the essence. We don't associate anything. As I think it's in Timothy as well, God exists, and he's speaking of his essence, in a dark cloud. It's in himself, only known to the Trinity. So I think those, I could have pulled up a lot more text, but I thought that those two are nice to kind of capture why we would deny being, that God's essence is identical to being and actuality. And rather we associate that what's understood, as you aptly pointed out, are the energies. Those can be understood. And therefore we associate being and actuality, which is another translation of energeia, with the energies and not the essence, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so, well, let me make a comment, and then maybe a helpful comment, and then another question about actus purus. So I noticed one of the quotations you just read out mentioned that there is no knowing the essence of God even in the age to come. Mm-hmm. And I guess that would help explain the difference in the personal eschatology between the East and the West, where in the West, of course, the emphasis is very much on seeing God in his essence, face to face. But if you, and in the East on theosis, becoming like God, the perfection of that process. And I guess it makes sense that if you have this view of the complete inaccessibility, even by grace of the divine essence to created minds, then you would have to have a different model of what final human beatitude looks like.
Right, exactly.
You can't go with the beatific vision.
Exactly. Yeah. So maybe that was helpful.
Okay, so that's that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then so then about actus purus, are we going to say then that there is such a thing as actus purus, but it's one of the energies, or are we just going to say, no, get away from this idea of actus purus? There's no such thing as actus purus.
Well, it's interesting because I found something in St. Maximus where he does talk about God as pure act and first cause.
Okay.
But he makes this distinction, and it's a similar distinction between essence and energy. He says, compared to creatures, God is pure act, right? He's the object of intention in the philosophical sense, right? Intentionality. He's pure act and first cause. But Maximus also says that God in himself is not pure act and first cause for the reasons just mentioned above. So there's two things. Yeah, we would say that everything you want to say with actus purus, right, and being identical to, that would be associated to the energies. So you're correct. And then we'll just say, but that is God. And I know it must be difficult. It took me a while too, because, I came from the West and I was educated as a Thomist too. And this is really hard for me to get. I don't know if it's just a kind of a different way of thinking. And I thought about part of the issue, especially going through Thomas Aquinas College, is there was no way to, you just don't conceive of God apart from essence. And so to have this kind of language, it's strange, bizarre. I mean, do you kind of have that feeling too, or was I just the only one to?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think my mind definitely goes back to Aristotle and Aquinas, and thinking about fundamental human cognition. Like, what does the mind latch onto? Well, it latches on to quid est, to essence.
Yeah.
And so in that, on my view, certainly it's not even worth trying to separate my patterns of thought from the seeking after the essence of a thing. That's just part of what it is for a human being to think, on my view, is to try to latch on to what's the essence. Now, I guess I can kind of.
But you know what? There's something in Aristotle just made me think about. Later picked up on Thomas, right? Because you mentioned the quid est, but the that it is too, right? In the order of knowledge, isn't it? That it is, and I think that's. I mean, you don't find this in antiquity and medieval. You don't get it till later, but I mean the concepts thereof, I think, in the mode of knowledge, that you first know that it is, and then you inquire to know what it is. So I think you could have a point of agreement here. Here, when you're identifying God as first cause and pure act, you are referring to his essence, that it is, right? But it's always through the energies. That's the only thing that you actually know. But what salvages this is that the essence is never separate from the energies. So,
right.
But I think it's a point of agreement. Like, I think if you kind of flesh this out, you can see how it's not so impossible to think that way. Because, I mean, the only difference is, I guess, in the beatific vision, you actually do behold on Rome, the Latin thought, the not comprehending it, but you have an intellectual participation with the essence, correct? By grace.
That's right. Yeah. Right.
So that inseparability. Yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about how the apatheticism goes together with the denial of actus purus. So is the motivation for denying that the essence is actus purus, that's coming from the apatheticism, I imagine, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's why I thought both those quotes kind of made that. And there's a lot more, obviously, going through the fathers. The ones I didn't bring up would have been really good too is Dionysius, obviously, the area of Pegite.
So I guess my worry about that then is I'm not sure it's well motivated to deny that God is actus purus, right? Because what apatheticism is supposed to do is to block the affirmation of things that are well known to us in the creaturely order of God, right? So we don't want to say that God is good in exactly the way that we're familiar with goodness as exemplified in creatures, because that would be to attribute to the divine essence a degree of knowability that is inconsistent with its transcendence. But when we say that God's essence is actus purus, actus purus is not something that we know about in an intimate, familiar way as with creatures. So when we say God's essence is actus purus, we're really identifying one thing that is completely beyond knowledge, named God, with another thing that is equally completely beyond our knowledge and experience, namely actus purus. In other words, let me put it this way. The term actus purus is already an apophatic term. It's already a term of denial, right? We are denying the presence in God of something that is, of something that only creatures have, namely potency. And so when we say God is pure act, it sounds like an affirmation, right? But it's actually on its
but
deeper,
it's not
its
pure
logic
it's not pure apophatic, right? Because isn't this what Thomas talks about is
I mean, think about
analogia entis, right? So there's, when you make an analogy, there's something that's both similar and not similar. And so you're just bringing up, well, in the notion of that, in the modus significandi, or in the mode that you actually even know, obviously there is some, it's not purely cataphatic. There is some notion, even with an analogy of negation. Is that, did I get you correct on that? But it's not pure apophaticism. Like there's nothing that actually
so I think
can be known. Like that's obviously not Aquinas's position as far as analogia entis goes, correct?
That's right. So Aquinas has a theory of analogy. The point I was just making is not about analogy, right? Because for Aquinas, analogy only enters in
similitude.
No.
Okay.
So for Aquinas, analogy enters in only when we want to make positive predications about God. So we want to say that God is wise, God is good, God is powerful. Yeah. That all requires analogy. However, Aquinas is very clear that when we negate of God, that when we deny that he has parts, or when we deny that he's weak, or when we deny that, whatever, that's univocal, right? So we're using the terms univocally there. There's no problem with negating univocally. It's just as long as you affirm only analogously. So my point was just, I'm not seeing the inconsistency between the apophaticism and the claim that God's essence is actus purus, because as I said before, the claim that God is actus purus is, its surface logic is one of an affirmation, but the deeper logic of that claim, if you understand actus purus in the way that Aquinas uses the term, is actually a negation. What you're really saying is there is no potency in God. There is no passive potency in God. Is really what we're saying when we say God is actus purus. And insofar as apophaticists are generally okay with negating of God, right? I don't know why there would be an issue with saying God is actus purus. All you mean is there is no potency in God. Now, of course, you're going to want to say there is potency in the energies, but then coming over to the essence, why can't we say that the essence is actus purus if all we mean by the essence is actus purus is that essence has no potencies?
Because the apophaticism in the fathers that I just mentioned, say John Damascus, Dionysius, Gregory Palamas, and Basil, goes much farther than that. That the negations don't even get to. This one says there is no names, even negative names. That it is literally beyond all unknowing. And so they won't even attribute any predicates. Really go to the energies. So I think the difference here is it takes apophaticism far deeper than the sort of kind of apophaticism that you mentioned there. Yeah.
So I can't say on this kind of view of the divine essence that it's not evil. I'm not to say that.
Only in, well, yes and no, in the kind of ways that we talked about there, like St. Maximus, that because the essence is not separated from the energies, what we mean by not evil, we're talking about the energies, and therefore God, but none of those names are actually even proper. Any negations, affirmations, anything to the essence. Yeah.
Yeah, no,
we can talk about what that in a meaningful way, and like, well, who God is outside of him, his essence, not his effects. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was.
So that would be a difference, wouldn't it, between?
Yeah, I was talking about the essence. So I just So I realized. Yeah. So you.
Yeah, there would be
predications
not
about
even
God, and those would be predications about strictly speaking, about the energies. But even about essence, I can't say that it's not evil. I can't say that it exists. I can't say. Okay. So
yeah, so you can say like difference. Maximus, in relation to the created order, you can, but not if you mean what the essence is in itself. That's why Maximus. Okay. You actually find Maximus say that God's pure act and first cause, but he doesn't mean that ad intra, not in his essence. He means only in relation to the way that you actually see that. Yeah, but God in himself is not pure act. That's why it says St. John of Damascus says, and Dionysius, he doesn't exist. So that's a privation, right? But then he qualifies not that he has no existence, but that he's above all existing things, even above existence itself, all the names and predications and negations. That's what they mean. They're just kind of qualifying that.
So given this degree of apophaticism, it sounds to me as if the thing to say is not to deny that God is actus purus in a way that would stand in distinction to the Western tradition of affirming that he's actus purus, but to say that God may or may not be actus purus and we just have no way of knowing. Right?
That's interesting. I never thought about. I don't even know what that means. If you, I mean, because that almost kind of seems like you have like, if no words or concepts could ever, in theory, then I wouldn't even put it into the dichotomy of an either or. That is, the fathers talk about God transcends all the antinomies. That so I can't be like he may or may not. It's because even that is kind of a predication of if all those names are beyond, like if God's essence is beyond that, I don't think I'd be comfortable with saying, or if that would even be a meaningful statement. It could be that God is pure act.
So how do we even get to say? I do. Yeah, that's helpful. But then I wonder how we even.
I mean, maybe I'm wrong about this, but from my kind of understanding that.
Yeah, no, that's helpful.
Right.
But then I think it was St. Maximus you were quoting, I think a couple times now, for the claim that God is not an existing thing, something that Thomists certainly agree with.
St. John of Damascus, yeah.
Sorry. Sorry, St. John of Damascus. Yeah, I confused them. My mistake. That God is not an existing thing, but, right, and then he qualifies, not that God is without existence. And then I wonder how he gets to say that God is that God is not without existence, if we can't say anything at all about the essence. Or is he talking about the energies when he says that?
I think obviously he has to be talking about the energies. And
okay.
And right. But also
there's something, sounds like it. Yeah.
There's something unique there too, though, because once you say that, well, but the essence is never separated from the energies. Obviously, you don't mean that he's like non-being or something like that. But it's, I think
Yeah, okay.
that's what he's trying to say. Like, so he's qualifying the way we don't want to attribute the word being to God, but we don't mean he's non-existent.
How do we know there is an essence then? How do we know there is a divine essence? How do we get that knowledge?
Oh, that's a really interesting point too. So I would say this is a remarkable kind of distinction between the Latin West and Orthodox, the Ordo Theologiae, the way that we do our theology. So we really don't do natural theology. You'll use this, you'll see the language in the Fathers, but by natural theology, what the East means is something entirely different from the West. The idea that, I'm trying to remember how Aquinas defines it, and then it's, again, it's actually brought up in John Paul II's Fides Ratio. Even in Vatican I think it's actually confirmed as far as kind of define what that is, what the intellect by the natural reason, light of reason alone can know without revelation. And kind of this Aristotelian Thomistic move, you obviously, you begin with this, what's more known in the senses, right? And you move from effect to cause and that's the way. Did I get that correct? I mean, just kind of with a broad brush. I know it's more complicated than that, but now, so as far as first principles go for Aristotle and Aquinas and the Latin West, on the distinction, what's better known to us versus what's better known by nature, they would put that, correct me if I'm wrong, obviously in sensu. You begin with the senses, and that methodology actually works. What would be different in the East is that we begin all of our knowledge with divine revelation. And so we're not going to have this, and not that we don't do philosophy, but we don't have the same kind of epistemology and methodology of, in an autonomous way, working from effect to designate a cause. And then obviously, even the Thomist is going to admit that, well, there's certain things you can never know, but you can know that it is, and this and this, that God's a first mover, and the various things like that. So what we would say to answer your question is the way that we know this is not by kind of natural theology, the way the West would speak in a kind of a autonomous philosophical sense of working from the senses up through the kind of causation, but this is revealed. Revealed theology is how we, and a lot of this is, I mean, how could you work this stuff out? Like the
that makes perfect sense. That makes perfect sense. But I would have thought that revelation was something carried on through the energies, right? And so if it's carried on through the energies, then is the way that we know about that there is an essence because God through his energies tells us so? Is that how it works?
I think that's something, no, I think it needs to, because that would be kind of through your more natural reasoning. I don't think you can know that. And I bet I can
know that there's an essence.
Not through kind of going from effect to cause like that. I don't think so. I think that, and again,
right.
Or that God's essence isn't unknown or something like that. Yeah.
Sorry, the suggestion wasn't that we reason from effect to cause, but that we accept on God's authority right?
That
As
his
revealed
essence is
to us
present
through the
in
energies.
his energies, right, in an unknowable
Yeah.
way. So you're being told through the church and the fathers and revealed theology that you can never know this, but I'm going to tell you a little secret. I'm always there in essence, even though you can't know. I'm fully present. It's not like God's like, hey, I'm just going to give a piece of my essence over here. So there is one sense that we
Right.
can actually say that he's simple, right? He's not composed of parts in his essence or something like that. That's a commonality, right? It's just when we get into fleshing out the kind of the specifics of actus purus, and the predicates being the exact same, that's you're going to start to get some differences. But we all believe that God's essence is simple, and this has to be revealed to us. It's not something that we know. But you come in contact with actual, so there's not a separation. I guess that's important too, because in the Thomistic understanding, you know God through the effects, right? So there's kind of a medium, like you're not directly experiencing God's essence. What the energies,
Not
the
in this
essence,
life, that's right.
yeah, what the essence energies distinction is going to say that you're actually experiencing, you're coming into contact with God in his essence, even though you can't, it remains completely unknowable. Well, how? Well, if God is, the essence doesn't enter into space and time, but it's unconnected from the energies, and the energies are immanent in, then you are actually, there's no mediation. Do you see what I mean? Between created effects.
Yeah, no,
and that's an important part
that.
of the energies. Mm-hmm. And this becomes important too, because you might remember this from Augustine. When you're in scripture and you're told about the theophanies, or the angel of the Lord. Now, on kind of a Thomistic view, what does that mean? Did God's essence come into space and time and appear as the theophany? This is what Augustine's actually wrestling with, correct? Because I think that, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, and Augustine's idea is a little bit different than obviously Aquinas on kind of absolute divine simplicity, but I'd argue that Augustine does have a doctrine of absolute divine simplicity. And then obviously Aquinas like refines that and goes further, but I can't find anybody, maybe you know, prior to Augustine that kind of has that notion of absolute divine simplicity. And so because of that, he's actually thinking about these theophanies, right? That is it actually directly the Lord? Well, on Augustine's concept, you can't actually say that. It has to be mediated through some type of created effects, right? So that's not actually, well, this issue comes up with the energies, with the Eastern Fathers. And this is one of the things that the energies actually is able to preserve. It actually is the Lord, not in essence, but his essence is there because it remains unconnected. There's no mediation. So what you're experiencing on Tabor, what Moses is experiencing, the glory of the burning bush, is actually God. There is nothing, there's no mediation of kind of creative effects, which you might find interesting. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I have a question about that, but I'd like to jump back to the apophaticism, if you don't mind, for just a moment. So you said that the divine essence is simple, that this is a point of agreement between us, but I thought we weren't allowed to say anything about the divine essence.
Yeah, so we're going to have to say that's in, I'm going to go just with the way St. John Damascus said too, about existing things. He's not he's both simple and not simple, and qualify that, and then say that he's simple in relation to us and what, but as far as what, so that would be ad extra, but as far as what he is ad intra, you can't bring God's essence down into even kind of a negative way.
Yeah. Do you mind if I jump in here real quick?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Suan, please go ahead.
So it seems to me that for the Orthodox, that this idea is that whenever we use language or we're kind of trying to conceptualize or kind of approach the divine essence, right? Like you're very careful about not wanting to directly name it, because even the naming act or even the saying it is this or that, right? It's inherently bound by our kind of like creaturely intellect and way of speaking, right? So then you would even say that if we say God is this, or if we say, well, we can go apophatic and say God is not this, and if we want to say logically, well, then that means he has to be this. You would be so careful as to say, well, but that's still within our creaturely domain, right?
Yeah, and again, I'm not an expert on this, so I'll do my best to. But these are really excellent questions. As far as I know, the fathers will simply go to this distinction of ad intra versus ad extra. So there's a way that you can speak about God's essence outside of himself, but then as far as ad intra, what he is in himself, like none of these names, obviously. And so the ad extra is obviously going to be in relation to creatures.
Yeah. So then like when
beyond that, I actually don't know. It's an excellent question.
Yeah, but
maybe that's because I'm not an expert on this.
So the idea is that like when God kind of, so to speak, looks into himself, right, and he's understanding himself, that's the kind of quote unquote knowledge that you and I could never have of God, right? But then there is a sense in which God kind of reveals himself exteriorly or beyond himself, right? And then that would be through the energies, correct?
Yes, correct.
Okay. And then the energies, if you don't mind a clarification, in what sense are the energies identical to God again?
They really are. Let me see. I've got another quote. I find like quoting people's a lot.
No, it's good. Yeah.
Than me trying to. Well, here's one that's really good. St. Basil talks about the role of energies and manifest, opposing them to unknowable essence. Quote, it is by his energies, he says, that we know our God. We do not assert that we can come near to the essence itself, for his energies descend to us, but his essence remains unapproachable. That wasn't the one I was looking for. There are two. So why is this difficult? Because in the West, we know of no other mode. We can't admit of a mode of existence of God other than essence. Let me put it that way. In the East, there are different modes of existence of God. God in himself, i.e. his essence, and then God outside of his essence, which we would call his activities or energies. Let's see. From the point of view, God is, as it were, limited by his essence, which is not essence. Oh, that was something else. Anyways, does that make sense? So we can speak about two. It really is God. There's God in himself, which we would call his essence, and then God outside of his essence, which we call his energies, which are not effects. And we'll talk a little bit about, but they're not substances either, because if you remember back on the kind of Aristotelian understanding of substance is that which can subsist on its own. Well, energies, it doesn't make any sense to say that energies can subsist without the essence of God. So they're not substances. They're not, but the fathers say they're not accidents either. So part of the problem too is that sometimes it seems like we can use some of this Aristotelian language, but we can't push it down. It just transcends. And I found that becoming Orthodox, that was a really kind of difficult thing for me, because my operating system was Aristotelianism 3.0. Like, I was just like, I don't understand. I can't understand anything beyond these kind of categories. And that was a considerable challenge for me, is going in to see that yeah, sometimes we can use this various language from the philosophers, but sometimes that stuff doesn't work at all. And I think we're kind of getting to that point when we're working through that, as you might see.
So I have a question about the odd intra versus odd extra predication distinction here. And you had said that this is one way in which we can say that God is simple. For instance, we can say that God is simple, odd, extra in relation to us and to his other creatures, but not odd intra, because of course we can't say anything about God odd intra.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And I'm not clear what it would mean for God to be simple only in his relation to us, because simplicity, as I understand, is not something that's had in relation to another thing. Simplicity is by its nature an intrinsic feature. I mean, to me, it doesn't make any more sense to say that something can be simple in relation to something. Well, it makes sense to say that something could be simpler than something else. But to say that something is absolutely simple in relation to something else, I mean,
as far as I know, I'll try my best. Yeah, I'll try my best to answer that. I see what you're saying. From what I remember reading to the fathers, they'll say, all we mean by that is as revealed to us, and therefore what's revealed is ad extra, is that God's essence isn't composed of parts. But what they won't say is that the predicates that we give are all identical to God's essence. So that his goodness, right, and that they're just virtual distinctions. And this becomes a debate in the Greek about katapanoia, or these just mental distinctions in the energies, these various things like that. So that's the only thing I can really say, is that I remember reading in the fathers that they said, what do we mean by God's essence is simple? It's not composed of parts, and that goodness does not actually attach to his goodness, is not his essence. It's his energy. Wisdom is not. Do you see what I mean? That seems to distinguish it from kind of absolute divine simplicity, but the agreement, so that would be the difference. The agreement would be, well, we all mean he's not composed of parts. And to admit distinctions in God doesn't mean that he's actually composed of parts. That might be a difference too.
So you said that, well, God reveals to us through his energies that his essence is not composed of parts. But then I wonder, and you were relying more generally on this distinction between natural theology as it's understood in the West and revealed theology, where in the East it's everything is in some sense revealed, and that all makes sense to me. But if it's revealed to us by God through his energies that his essence is not composed of parts, then it's not clear to me why we can't then say his essence is not composed of parts.
What is in, I think, extra, but we just don't have any. None of the names can actually get into the essence in itself, is I think what they're saying. So.
Right, and that's something that like Thomists say too, right? None of our names as taken from created things can accurately describe the divine essence, and so we say that's why we only affirm of God analogically, never univocally.
But I think you would still say that those are ad intra, whereas we would say, I don't know, like. From outside, we say it's simple, but that's what I'm saying is, like, there really is, God doesn't have that in his essence, because there is no concept or name. So all that the fathers will talk about in an extreme of apophaticism is in relation to creation. That's what we could say about the essence. So the distinction that,
Right.
well, from in himself as the existence, the essence actually is in itself. No, like you can't say it's composed of parts, not composed of parts. I think that's their point. There's nothing that can be said.
Well, but I guess if there's nothing that can, right, I guess I'm just, if there's nothing that can be said, then why does God reveal that his essence is simple?
Oh,
It
I don't
seems
know.
like it's not.
That's a good question. I
Okay.
don't know the will of God.
Yeah, I
pretend
guess
to
I
know
mean,
the
I
will of
just,
God.
like when I think of why God reveals things, there's a number of reasons, I suppose, right? That he wants to reveal in order to our beatitude. But the first immediate reason that I think of when God reveals something to us is that it's true, and he wants us to know it,
Mhm.
and he wants us to share that information with others to the best of our ability.
Yeah,
and so
why not say that? Yeah, that's a good.
yeah,
He wanted us to know. He wanted us to know and then
right.
not
But
know
if we
certain
know,
things. Yeah.
if he wants us to know and what he reveals is true, then when he reveals that his essence is simple, it seems like we can know that his essence is, which seems like it's already a problem with the extreme apophaticism, and that we can accurately say that his essence is simple, which would certainly be in conflict with the extreme apophaticism.
I'm not convinced of that. I'm not, because of that. I mean, if you hold to that there actually is a distinction. So the way that you're seeing a relation to creation as far as what you know, yeah, it doesn't seem to be composed, and God wants to reveal that. But as far as, and part of this is fleshed out that, again, I mean, you have to, in some sense, make this doctrine in contrast to the Latin, because that's the way that it actually played out.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So, for
Right.
example, what you're saying is really kind of Barlam's position, who is an Aristotelian, who's actually trying to argue this. So what we get is, well, it's not like that. It's not, we can't actually say those things. Eunomius has a kind of very similar position to the Thomists, but although he arrives at a different conclusion. So as far as that, like, I don't know actually how to answer that beyond just, I do know that God, like you said, God wants us to know certain things. And at times it looks like, well, isn't that the same thing as just absolute divine simplicity? And maybe it's because I'm not an expert on this, but I do know enough that, well, you really do, in both Barlam and Eunomius, have a doctrine of absolute divine simplicity that Basil against Eunomius and Palamas is arguing against. So there has to be some sort of distinction. Beyond that, I don't know. These are excellent questions.
Yeah, can I hop in with two things real quick? So what I want to do is maybe just kind of express some of my thoughts so far about this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then I want to ask Christopher a question, then I want to ask you, Father Deacon, a question. And maybe if there are any other thoughts you want to have, then we can we can fit those in, because I don't know if you want to go all 2 hours.
Oh,
I'm going to run and get my charger for a moment.
I thought you said 5 hours.
I'll be right back.
No, I'm kidding.
No. Well, okay,
I'm tired. I really couldn't do that.
No, it's okay. Yeah, I think I'll wait for Christopher to come back, because this particular question I want to ask you, I think it would be good clarification for everyone who's listening so far, and even for Christopher. Not because I think he needs it, but just for the sake of clarifying everything that's going on, because there's been a lot that I think has been really interesting. So I'll just wait for Christopher. All right, there we go. Yeah, you can hear. All right, cool. So yeah, I mean, what I found really interesting and really telling, Father Deacon, is that when you mentioned the fact that, in the West, we kind of have this very autonomous view of reason, right? And I think even, to kind of use an example, I think it was Thomas Nagel in his book A View from Nowhere. He talks about how reason kind of almost allows us to transcend ourselves and to have this universal perspective on things, right? And that in some sense, what the East is acknowledging rather is that no matter what, we're always going to be bound in that perspective of our, from, for instance, as a human being, I'm going to reason as a human being. I'm going to be able to relate to God only insofar as, as a human being. Whereas God, right, like in God himself, ad intra, as you put it, right, God is not thinking like, oh, I'm simple, right? Or God's not thinking like, God is just, it's almost kind of beyond even any words or expressions or sentences that I could convey, right?
Yeah.
So is that
and
kind
we'd
of
also say too, I totally forgot about this, that you're right, we could say that like God is simple, but that predicate's not identical with his essence. So that maybe that's one way to, the things that we say about God are not actually identical to his essence in the various ways. And we would see that poses certain problems. But I like your point too. And I worked on this in kind of epistemology that, first of all, everything's kind of theory laden. We have like our kind of concepts that we impose on the way, both our methodologies and the way that we view, even like what a person would call self-evident. This is self-evident, and the other person's like, no, it's not self-evident, right? And from an Orthodox point of view, we would say that obviously we're diseased from the fall. We're corrupted. We've abandoned life. We've kind of turned, and we can continue to do that. And so we create kind of stories and narratives and paradigms and philosophies that make us look at the world incorrectly. And as St. Justin Popovich on St. Isaac the Syrian's theory of knowledge talks about, that the way to actually see the world correctly is to become like God, to start participating, purifying one's nous, which I'd never heard of before coming from. And so I thought that was interesting. I don't know if that kind of relates to what you're talking about, but yeah, in that sense, there is no autonomy. It's that everybody's messing up and creating these kind of false systems, and they're not able to see the world or God correctly.
Yeah, Christopher, what do you think? Do you think that's kind of like the fundamental difference that's going on here with how we view just reason itself?
That's part of it. So as I've understood Father, he's, I think, correctly told us that, this is not going to fit well with an Aristotelian metaphysical framework. And I think that's absolutely right. But my worry is it goes deeper than that, right? It's not just the rejection of the Aristotelian categories that I'm sensing here, right? But a rejection, for example, of excluded middle, right? The idea that we can say of God at least that he is or he isn't this or that, right? And the excluded middle is not an Aristotelian principle. We generally tend to think that that excluded middle is more foundational than just Aristotelian metaphysics, that it's part of one of the self-evident principles of logic. So I do have worries about that. And then I guess my other issue is that this isn't apophaticism, right? Because apophaticism, of course, from the Greek for apophasis, way of denial, way of negation. And it sounds to me from what Father said so far that we're not even allowed to make negations of our creaturely concepts of God, right? We can't even say of God that he doesn't, in his essence, ad intra. We can't even say of God's essence ad intra that it is without parts, or that it is without potency, or any of these other things that apophaticism, historically construed, was certainly fine with saying. I mean, so this isn't right. I mean, there's some levels that we might say here, right? There's the cataphists, and among the cataphists, there levels, right? You have Scotus and other cataphists who are comfortable with univocal predication, univocal positive predication of God. Then you have Aquinas taking a middle way here, where he's okay with cataphasis about God, but only by way of analogy. And then you have the apophaticists who are only okay with denial of God, the removal of creaturely concepts from God. So all we can say about God is what he's not. And historically, that's been, I think, seen as the extreme view, but it seems like this is more extreme than that. We can't even say of God what he is not. So I guess my concern is like, well, let's make sure that we're flagging the fact that this isn't an apophatic view. This is more pessimistic about the adequacy of our language than even the apophaticists, because this is a view on which it seems we cannot even truly deny certain predicates, any predicates of God.
So just to clarify, who are the apophaticists that you have in mind?
I don't. I mean, arguably Augustine. This is way out. I mean, we're getting into history now. Theological history is not my wheelhouse. But I would all want to say St. John Chrysostom, possibly. But regardless of who we identify as being in this tradition, the apophatic tradition is one on which it's by definition permissible to deny of God. You can't affirm, but you can deny. I mean, it's what the word means, right?
Which is what we're saying. Then, I mean, we just have to remember what words mean is going to be kind of paradigm or relative. So there might be some similarities, but obviously in the West, what apophaticism means is something entirely different. Not entirely, there might be some similarities in the sense of, i.e. negation. But you are correct. In the East, it's going to, and definitely in St. John Chrysostom as well, it would take this view. It means something different in this system and so again, there are distinctions. I like that you actually brought up that it seems to me that you'd be denying law exclude the middle. And again, what I hope to show going through and have shown is saying in a way yes, in a way no. There's distinctions, like we don't want to fall into some type of Eastern mysticism or fideism or something like that, and saying that there's nothing at all. So I think if you qualify, so what we would say is, and again, St. Maximus talks about this too, God transcends the logical antinomies. And one thing that you will see in the East too is, and I wouldn't say just in the Western Christianity, I think it goes back all the way to the pre-Socratics. There's these kind of dialect, the system that they're working in, that they kind of presuppose, has a dialectics of opposition. So if that's what you mean by law of exclude the middle, because obviously in one sense, we're going to say that it's either God that we're talking about or not God. But in other senses, he transcends that. And what I think you were right to pick up on is something unique about the Eastern Orthodox system is, unlike the philosophical systems of the West, they are not restricted to a dialectics of opposition. One in many are not opposed. God can be known and unknown, like the things could be. So we make these kinds of distinctions, but it's not, I wouldn't couch in terms of what you said, that there's nothing that could ever be said about God's essence. As long as you make those distinctions, there's in a way that is related to creatures that we're actually talking about the essence. But in itself, no, none of those predicates are identical with God's essence or could penetrate even the negative. That might be bizarre, because of like the system that you're coming from, and I understand that.
Yeah, so that's why I qualified. I said, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, right? The view is one on which absolutely no predications, positive or negative, can be made of God's essence ad intra.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Right. So then that sounds to me like it's clearly stronger than apophaticism. Apophaticism just says
in the
no
West,
positive predications.
Right. Yeah.
And
I actually remember reading that in
the Greek.
Mm-hmm.
The Greek is not a Western construct, and the Greek means way of to say.
Well, words do evolve. For example, and probably in light of various issues like this actually coming up and having to suss it out. But hypostasis, right? That is substance.
Yeah, sure.
But it begins to take on, it has a history that's connected to substance, but it begins by the 4th, 5th century, begins to take on a different meaning person, and a connection to prosopon, like of the face, right? So that's not surprising to me. I'd actually expect that in light of certain controversies and working out that it would change from its etymological roots and somewhat, but it preserves the idea of negation. Yeah.
Right. So, but it's important to note it's a very different kind of negation. So, apophaticism, as I'm familiar with it, and I think as many in the West at least would be familiar with it, is a view in which, is a view on which only negative predications of God are permitted. What's being denied, right, are these positive predications of God. Whereas what it sounds to me, the way you're representing the Orthodox view is one on which we don't deny that we can make positive predications of God. Rather, we deny that we can make any predications of God, positive or negative. And essence, I just want people to see that that's a strictly stronger view, logically speaking, than apophaticism, as I think many in the West certainly understand it. Just want people to understand it's a significantly stronger view.
But I think you need to go there. Yeah. I mean, if one's serious about how unknowable the essence is,
right,
you can't then go, yeah, but I can have this type of negative knowledge about the essence. So you can't kind of have your cake and eat it too. So there is a way that you can talk about, like, well, it's talking about the essence. Well, you would have to qualify that. That's what we just did in relation to creation. God outside of himself, yeah, of course we could. But if you're going to take transcendence seriously, then you're going to actually have to be committed to that. So I think that's probably what's motivating that.
Okay.
Yeah, if you don't mind, let me ask maybe one question to Father Deacon and then one question to Christopher, and we can wrap this up. Let me and I'm probably opening up a can of worms now, but to Christopher. So I was really interested in your response to Father Deacon's question on the theophanies in the Bible, right? When God reveals himself, or it says, God is in the bush, or Abraham seems to commune with God, right? What's going on there if you believe in absolute divine simplicity?
Great. Yeah, thank you. This is, I'm really glad you asked that question, because I wanted to get back to this mediation point before we wrapped up. So I mean, if you can sense it, right, you can see it or you can hear it by means of the human senses, then obviously that is self not a that is not God in himself. It can't be, right? I mean, I don't think, Father can correct me if this is not the case, but I would imagine that even the East would want to say about the divine energies that they are not in themselves visible or audible, that our way of contact with them would be through the intellect. But he can clarify about that. So insofar as, right, Moses sees a burning bush, right, he's seeing a visible fire. That obviously can't be the divine essence, or any other part of God who is wholly invisible. So insofar as it would be visible or otherwise sensible, accessible to human senses, that could not itself be God. Now, with that said, I don't know, I don't think I have the same kind of worry about mediation that maybe Father has, because I think that nevertheless can count as direct contact with God. Here's why. So, I mean, I think about if I'm sitting across the room from my wife and I say, I see my wife unmediated without any kind of medium between us, strictly speaking, in the physical order, that's not true, right? I can't get my wife inside my eyeballs, right? What I'm directly experiencing are photons. And likewise, if I hear my wife's voice, what I immediately experience is not my wife's vocal cords inside my ears, right? But rather sound waves that she generates and which travel to me. But the thing is, that doesn't stop us from saying I have an immediate experience of my wife, just because there's air between us or light between us or sound waves between us. And so I think we should also not shy away from saying that Moses has an immediate experience of God when he comes into contact with the burning bush, because although what he directly sees is a created thing, that created thing is an immediate representation of God. And if we're going to start saying that, no, well, it's got to be the thing itself, then we're going to get into an extreme form of skepticism about having immediate experiences of anything, because our sensible experiences of created things are always mediated in the same kind of way, in the same fundamental way as well. Obviously there's a greater degree, for example, of mediation between us now, right? Because it's not just, we're not even in the same room, we're not even in the same state, right? So it's mediated through, the internet and our screens and the technology that we're using. But even when you're in the same room with someone, it's not as if their body is inside your eyeballs or their vocal cords are inside your ears. Even face-to-face communication with another person, even face-to-face experience with another person, is mediated by entities that are not that person. And so if we don't want to be really skeptical about saying that I have an immediate experience of my wife when I'm face-to-face with her, right? And we shouldn't, we don't want to be that skeptical about immediate experience of the thing. Then we also shouldn't be, on my view at least, we shouldn't shy away from saying that Moses has a direct experience of God in the burning bush, or that, for that matter, that those present at Christ's baptism had an immediate experience of God the Father, of his voice, through his voice, or that the apostles had immediate experience of God the Father on Mount Tabor during the Transfiguration, because created effects in that context play the same role that photons or sound waves play when I have the experience of another human person, even face to face with them.
Yeah, Father Deacon, do you have anything to say?
Well, I mean, I don't think I understand what you're saying about, like, our wives or something like that. But the essence of our wives are actually present in the the temporal physical world and stuff. So whereas we can't say that about God. So that I think the problem on an absolute divine simplicity model is that whereas I think you're correct that I can experience my wife in the sensible, but her essence is actually really there in the matter. I don't think any of us would say that with God. So my concern would be, well, then I'm just experiencing kind of a causal chain. Now, what we would deny is that the fire in the bush is not created. It's uncreated light. So there is no mediation. It's not a sense. It's not that there's not actually a bush, and the senses aren't involved. But here destroys the kind of the either or dichotomy of opposition here. You're still a sensible being, like you're still seeing a bush and there's a burning, but that's actually really God. There are no effects that you have to, he's actually as cause right there with you. Now, part of being able to explain this too, we have a somewhat of a different anthropology of talking about the intellect, the nous, which the fathers begin to retranslate to be like the eyes of the heart, the most inner recess of the human being, and obviously the body. That in Orthodoxy, we don't actually mediate God through and experience God in our intellect, but our nous. And so what we would say on Mount Tabor, Moses, it's not actually, although his senses are still in the world and he's seen something, what he's experiencing is not being mediated either through his senses or intellect, but it's going straight into his nous. And so it kind of destroys that dichotomy of oppositions, those dialectical oppositions. It's like, yeah, the senses are involved. And really, the only reason why that stuff is all out of order, really the senses should be in order with the intellect, and the intellect submitting to the heart, right? But the knowing as far as God and the experience of God doesn't occur in the intellect, it occurs in the heart. That's fundamentally different. But does that kind of make some sense? So I'd say that, again, I don't think the analogy works, because I think you're correct to point out we really are experiencing our wives, but her essence is, and your wife's essence is really there in space-time. God's isn't. And therefore it poses a particular problem then that I have to then simply be mediated through a chain of effects in which God is not present in the same way that anybody else is in the temporal space or world. And then lastly, just to sum up, we would say that no, in the divine light, the uncreated light, the fire, you're actually experiencing no mediation even through sensibles, even though you're still sensing something.
Let me let Christopher give kind of his response, and then I will ask one question to Father Deacon, and then we'll wrap up.
So, just a very quick diagnostic question so I can try to figure out how to respond. If I were standing next to Moses as he were having this theophany, right, would I be able to see that the bush is on fire?
No, we actually have several accounts, possibly no, actually, because we have several accounts of the uncreated light where people aren't seeing it. So that's an excellent question.
So then, yeah.
So somebody's actually seeing it, and the other person is standing there and isn't.
So is it okay? So in that way, at least, it sounds as if, to the extent we have a disagreement at all, that disagreement is about what's actually happening on Mount Tabor, where it sounds like the Eastern interpretation is much more of a mystical experience within Moses kind of thing, whereas I think the Western tradition would say something closer to, the bush is actually on fire. It's a miraculous fire, but it's a sensible fire. And God is speaking through this created fire. So it's not maybe so much a distinction in a difference of opinion in how we experience God, but maybe a difference, or to a certain extent, maybe our deeper theological differences about the experience of God here are being masked by different readings of the actual biblical events. So it sounds to me more like you want to read Moses' encounter with the burning bush more or less similarly to, say, the ecstasy of Saint Teresa than to an actual external event, which is okay. So be it. But I guess your response to I didn't grasp the response to my analogy. It seemed like the kernel, the core of that response consisted in saying that my wife's essence is in this world. That's of course right, and that's of course different from God's essence, which is not. But I don't see how that makes a difference, right? That the analogy didn't rest on where my wife's essence is located, whether in this world or out of this world. The analogy rested on the fact that no matter where my wife's essence is located, when I say that I have a direct, immediate experience of my wife, I do not mean that she's in my eyeballs. No matter where her essence is located, it's not in my eyeballs. So there's going to be mediation in a strict physical sense of photons as they bounce off her, and mediation in my eyes, through my nerves, until I start actually having
I agree with that. There's some sort of mediation. I just want to draw on the distinction between transcendence and immanence of essence.
Sure. But then if we say that there's a kind of mediation there, that doesn't prevent us from saying that I have an immediate direct experience of my wife, because what is an immediate direct experience of anything if I don't have it when I am face to face with that person? Then I don't see why we should hesitate to say that Moses has a direct, immediate experience of God on Mount Tabor in the burning bush, even though, at least on my view, it's happening through the mediation of a created fire. And to me, it sounds like, at least to me, it seems as if there's no, that analogy doesn't rest on where God's essence is located, whether it's in this world or that world. It just rests on, is there something coming directly between me and God's essence, right? Insofar as we don't want to say that God's essence is in.
I think it absolutely does make a difference if it's immanent or transcendent, because, for example, if you received the handing down of an ancient letter over the last 6 centuries written to you in the future, that's a mediation of the cause. Sure. Would you say that, I can still say I have a direct experience of that person? I don't think you would actually say that.
No, not in that case, but I would say I have a direct experience of my wife when I'm face to face with her, despite the fact that my wife is not in my eyeballs or in my brain.
Right. So, I mean, first of all, by direct experience, we don't mean are there other things involved? Is her essence in, like, I would say that, but I'm not even convinced that I can have an immediacy with my wife through her and that her essence is embodied, right? That's not through a causal chain. And so, and I think that that's fleshed out simply because of the eminence, the embodiment of her essence in the material. You can't actually say that about God. And so what you get is something much more like the analogy of the causal chain of the letter going back 6 centuries ago, in which case, so you're playing up on like, okay, there is a sense of mediation, right, involved in, but that difference actually is all the difference. whether the essence is actually embodied in the mediation, is actually present there, is what allows you to say that I have immediate experience. Otherwise, you're left in the analogy of the letter, going back 6 centuries. That would be my point. In which case, we wouldn't say, I'm actually experiencing God and having immediate presence with him.
But my point about my wife was that there is a causal chain, right? That there is a causal story to be told about how a picture of my wife, a visual image of my wife, or my wife's gets to my eyes, or the story, a story about how my wife's voice gets to my ears. There's a physical causal story to be told there that involves a causal chain. There is a chain, right? Like without the photons between us, I wouldn't see my wife. Without the sound waves in the air, I wouldn't hear my wife. And yet that mediation, that level of mediation at least, does not prevent us from saying that I have an immediate experience of my wife. And so when we come
to you have immediate experience of her essence through that, right? Which you wouldn't, because like in the Thomistic theory I think you do, right? Because let's just go off the like kind of Aristotelian. So you need a medium, and you at least need a cause and effect. I don't know if you need a chain of them or something like that, but you have the transparent medium in which her essence through the sensible impresses, right? You have the image, the phantasm going into then your body, in which then resides into your mind.
Yeah.
So that, what does Aristotle say? When you actually know the person, know the essence, what are you actually knowing? You're knowing the form without the matters. And the form is the essence. So I can't say that about God.
Well, not for Aristotle. Actually, the essence for Aristotle is the form and the matter together.
Okay, so right, let's go with the Thomistic, right? That you're able to abstract the form from the phantasm on the potential intellect, and the active intellect is able to possess that in something like that. But you really have that, right?
Yeah.
And Aristotle actually says the form is the distinction between knower and known is one and the same. Correct?
Right, but I'm not seeing how that's touching my point about, that's all right, but I don't see how that's touching my point about, in both cases, there is a kind of mediation. I don't, there is a causal chain between me and my wife when I see her or I hear her voice. And likewise, there's a causal chain between Moses and God when he has the experience on the burning bush and on Mount Tabor. And what I'm saying is, if we're okay with saying that I have an immediate experience of my wife, despite the fact that there's a causal chain between us, then we should be okay with saying that Moses has a direct experience with God.
I didn't say all causal chains or causality prevents one from having immediate experience, but only certain types.
Good. Okay. So then what's the certain type of causal chain?
So the fact that, and that's why I said the eminence and the embodiment of an essence being present immediately to me, such that I could possess that and have a contact. If I have to use a chain, well, that's fine. I can't say that about God. So what I'm saying is all you're left with is a causal chain without. So I'm not saying, it's causal chain is the one that actually makes you never be able to have an experience. Otherwise, your argument would be correct. What I'm saying is that if you can't actually have a contact through a causal chain the way that you can with your wife, then you don't have an immediate experience. And that is exactly what you're going to have to say with God is, that's not the way in which we have a causal chain with God. And that's why I said what it's more like is the letter going back to some man 6 centuries ago.
Yeah, I see that. I mean, I agree with you about the letter case, because I mean, it seems to me that that causal chain is just too long for us to say that I have an immediate experience. I don't see a difference between that case and the case of my wife, other than the length of the chain. It seems like what's really doing the work is the length of the chain. And then that would generate hard questions about, well, exactly how long can the chain get before we
I see what you're saying.
That I have.
So you actually think that God immediately acts at that point in time?
I want to say that Moses has an immediate experience of God on Mount Tabor because the causal proximity to God there is close, that it's like the case of me and my wife, where even though there's a mediation by photons when I see her and a mediation by sound waves when I hear her voice, nevertheless, it's proximate enough that I feel comfortable in saying I have an immediate experience of my wife. And likewise, I think with Moses, it's proximate enough for him to say I had an immediate experience of God, or as close to as an immediate experience of God as one could have in this life. Let's put it that way.
Also, I was curious, what do you think, how in your explanation do you then, if on the Thomistic conception you're committed to God's essence is actuality and there's no potency that could be attributed to God, how do you explain he acts? Was he always burning the bush? I'm just curious how you.
No, I don't want to say he
in like kind of a Thomistic theory.
Yeah, I don't want to say he was always burning the bush, because of course the bush didn't always exist, so he couldn't have been always burning it. I mean, so what I want to say.
Stop me if I open up a can of worms. Please let me know.
That's fine.
And you too, Christopher, because I don't want to keep you guys for 5 hours. I was joking about that, but
no, it's fine. It's fine. No, I think we're getting into that. This is really good. So, I mean, at the most fundamental level, God is the cause of the burning. And so that makes it true to say that God burns the bush, that God acts to burn the bush. He is the cause of the burning. I don't think there has to be a change or modification in God at the time that the bush burns in order for him to be the cause of the bush's burning.
So something could be cause without effect. Without being
nothing can be caused without it.
Okay.
Without,
I mean, a lot of this kind of
yes.
gets into, you probably know where it's going, the modal kind of collapse arguments that,
right.
Sometimes I think they're presented incorrectly. But let me share, and Suan, stop me after this if you don't want to go any further, but just perhaps we could end with this thought. So I have a friend that his name's Bill, came up with this analogy that, so you're in a dark room. So this is going to be in terms of like necessary and contingent and cause and effect. I'm just curious, Christopher, what you think about. So you're in a dark room and you turn on your flashlight, right? Now, what you see is the effect is that white spot on the wall, correct? And then you turn it off.
Yeah.
And the spot disappears. So obviously the beam of light of the flashlight's the cause, and the white spot on the wall is the effect. Now, you're also going to note that the beam is not only obviously the originating cause of the spot, but when you have that on, it's the continuing cause of the spot. That means that the spot depends on the beam at every moment.
Yep.
At which the spot exists, correct? So you follow me so far on this?
Yeah.
So let's call it the beam spot analogy. And the beam spot analogy is obviously analogous to the divine creating universe existing. So by the way, this ends up becoming a concern for us with absolute divine simplicity that we think that and the energies gets out of. That's one reason why I bring it up. But I just kind of curious, I won't go too far deep into it, but just how he fleshed this out. So now imagine, since we say that the spot depends on its existence, on the existence of the being, and it's not vice versa. So the contingency, so we're talking now about contingency of that spot, depends on the contingency of the being. If the spot's contingent, then so must be its cause. Because at any time t, the light's on and the spot appears, right? So to say that the spot is contingent is to say that at t might not have existed. So now I'm building all this because in light of kind of the burning bush or anything in the kind of created order. So that we'd say, obviously, if the spot didn't exist or the burning bush didn't exist, then the light would not have, or the cause, not been on at t. And it would be absurd to say that both the light, that it's actually a cause in actuality and not potency, that it's actually and not that the spot, like the effect. So to say that like the light's on at t, i.e.
All right, so sorry about that. I had some technical difficulties on my end, but now I'm back. I'm hoping that that won't happen again. But yeah, the recording was saved, so nothing was lost. All good. Okay. So I left off on Father Deacon finishing out the analogy, and then I guess you gentlemen were talking while I was gone. So
yeah, Christopher, you just start back over.
Yeah, sure, Christopher. Sorry about that.
Right. So first of all, I guess it doesn't seem to me like this is an argument against the Thomist view. This is going to be an argument which, if successful, is going to be a problem for any view on which God as a necessary being is the cause of created things which are contingent. Yeah, I guess I would want to hear more about what the problem is for the Thomists specifically here. But
well, I think because we would say that there can be potencies in God, and you would never say that. So we wouldn't say they're actual causes. Like we would actually say the energies as logoi are potential causes. Right. There's potency and they're the dunamis, the powers, or something probably akin to second potency, first actuality in Aristotle, something like that. That are actualized by God, like the essence of God, like what St. Maximus calls thought wills. So, but a Thomist won't say that. So, therefore,
yeah. Well, the reason the Thomist doesn't want to say that is because if you say that there are potencies in God, in his energies, in your case, then the question arises of what actualizes those potencies, right? And I guess it would be open to, is the view here that what actualizes the potencies in the divine energies is the divine essence? Is that how
it's the will, and will's a property of essence is what
right.
So there's nothing in, because will is not identical with essence, it doesn't have that kind of like couched out, and that kind of, it's not necessary. So it's not even bound by the will's not even bound by the essence, even though it's a property of the essence. So we wouldn't say that God's will is identical with his essence. So the property, as opposed to his person, it's a property of, it's willed through his person, through the logoi, and then it's actualized. So again, we can speak about them being, well, the logoi are both actuality and potency. Right? So they're actuality in the sense that they're uncreated, but they're not activated. The will has not moved through them to. So the cause of that would be coming from God, for the will of God that actualizes. And so it seems to me like that gets around the whole kind of idea of necessity, and certainly something, if like you said, that if God is pure act and every predicate is identical with his essence, one of those is God is, creator or something like that, eternally, right? And that's not just a name from our side, but like it's a predicate that God actually has. Then wouldn't it seem that he has to be, you can't be eternally creator without a creation or something? These are issues that come up, as I'm sure you're aware.
So on the Thomist view, God's being creator is a predicate entirely from our side. That's the standard Thomist view. We wouldn't want to put that in God in himself, because then you would get a modal collapse of some kind.
Well, then how do we know? I guess I'd be wondering, well, then how do we know that it belongs to God at all? Like, how do we know that even
belongs to God insofar as he is the cause of created things, and therefore is a creator?
Yeah, Father Deacon, let me have you just ask one more question.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but I knew I was going to open up a can.
No, you're good. You're good.
Sorry, can I? No. Swan, I'm sorry. There was a line of questioning I was trying to pursue. So
sure.
I'll try to make this as brief as possible. So, Father, you said that what I'm trying to get across with this is why the Thomist wants to say there are no potencies in God. So you said that the energies are actualized by the will. Does the will have potencies or no?
Oh, I don't think, I've never seen the actuality of potency ever applied to will.
Okay. So then whatever you're going to
transcends. Yeah.
So then whatever you're going to say about how the will actualizes the potencies of the energies without itself having potencies, I'm just going to say that that's how the divine essence actualizes the potencies of created things without having any potencies. I'm just going to tell that same story.
Yeah, but we don't, you have to identify will with essence, though, identical to essence, where we wouldn't actually say that.
That's not going to make a difference. That's not going to make a difference.
You don't think so if like it's necessary then?
Okay, so let me have Christopher.
Yeah, it's just what.
Let me just have. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
Sorry,
Christopher. Just explain why you believe that you kind of you said that you could do the same thing basically that an Orthodox person could do with your argument, and then I'll let that. If that's okay, I'll let that be the last word, because we start out with the essence energy distinctions. Now we're getting to absolute divine simplicity. We can do a part 2, to be honest, but just like
sure.
We're getting to part 2 right now.
I'd be happy to.
Sure.
Okay. So the reason I mention that is because so if you think it's a problem for a God without potencies to actualize potencies of created things, then I think you're gonna run into an infinite regress, either an infinite regress, or you're going to have that same kind of issue in your own ontology, whatever it looks like. Because if you say, well, in order for God to actualize the potencies of created things, God must himself have potency, at least in his energies or what have you, then I'm just going to say, okay, so what actualizes those potencies? And you'll say, it's this thing, whatever X, we'll call it X, whatever that might be. And then I'll say, okay, does X have potencies? And you can say, yes or no. Let's just suppose you say, yes, it does. And I'll say, what actualizes the potencies of X? And you say, oh, well, that's Y. And I'll say, does Y have potencies? And just say, yes, right? And then you say, okay, Z is, so what actualizes the potencies of Y? Well, Z does. Z actualizes the potencies of Y. And obviously you don't want to continue in this way. At some point, you're going to want to say that we reach a point where the actualities of something the potencies of something are actualized by something which itself does not have any potencies. And if at that point, anybody who eventually says that, which you're going to have to say if you don't want to face an infinite regress, is going to have to tell a story about how something that doesn't have potencies actualizes the potencies of something that does have potencies. And the point I'm just making is, if you have to tell that story, then you're in the same boat as the Thomists when it comes to the same boat as the Thomist, who has to explain how the essence of God, which is totally without potency, actualizes the potencies of created things. Whatever that story is, it'll be precisely parallel to the story that anybody else will have to tell about how the will of God actualizes the energies of God, despite the fact that the will of God has no potencies, or how the essence of God actualizes the will of God, despite the fact that the essence has no potencies. Wherever you stop the chain, you're going to have to tell a story about how something that doesn't have potency actualizes other potencies. And once you have to tell that story, you're in the same boat as us.
Okay, so let me let Father Deacon just give one last word. And the reason why I want Father Deacon to go last is, or give the last word, is because he was the guest on the show, and he's the one who started off everything. So yeah, I just want to.
You guys are too nice to me. Come on. So, I mean, that's a point of departure too, because again, that's part of the reason why we have the kind of radical apophaticism in the East. We're not going to couch those terms and let cause as actuality of some potency. The essence transcends that stuff. And so we're not going to get into the same issues, I'd say, because we're not actually, because of the apophaticism, because we're not going to say that those predicates even are identical with the essence of God, that his act of will is necessary, because if his essence is necessary, then his act of will is necessary. And I think, I have more work to do on this, but as far as what I've read so far, that this is precisely the negation of the absolute divine simplicity and replacement with essence energies with that type of apophatism is exactly what gets us out of. So we can have more, obviously, part 2 to talk about, and perhaps I could flesh that out some more. But I want to thank you guys for having me on here, and Chris, wonderful questions, by the way, and responses to this too. I think that you definitely represented the Thomistics position correctly, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate your kindness to me too as well.
I appreciate you enlightening me about the Orthodox tradition on this. I'm woefully ignorant of it, so I appreciate.
I still feel ignorant too. I hope I did a well enough job. Again, I still feel like I'm learning so much, and I'm not an expert at all. And so, for anybody watching, forgive me if I got something incorrect. I try to always be teachable.
All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for this very wonderful and illuminating conversation. I deeply loved it and enjoyed it. And I have so much respect for the East and the Orthodox. So I'm very happy to have you on, Father Deacon. And I hope in the future we can have, more Orthodox guests, and including Father Deacon back to enlighten and, teach us, and to hopefully have this exchange of ideas. So thank you so much.
Get somebody smarter than me. I feel like,
you can call upon me. You can call upon me for that anytime, Suan. I have many episodes worth of questions about various Orthodox doctrines.
All right.
Yeah.
Well,
thank you, Christopher. Thank you, Suan. And God bless you guys.